In the late 2000s, young people everywhere were playing those popular plastic guitar rhythm games. If only their parents would just buy them a real guitar already, they knew their skills would translate, right? I personally owned a copy of Guitar Hero 3 for the Wii, and embarrassingly actually committed a lot of hours into getting pretty good at it before I started playing real electric guitar. Recently thinking back to how well these skills may have actually translated into real guitar skills also got me thinking how well these plastic guitars could translate into something real themselves. So browsing cheap controllers on eBay that I wouldn't mind destroying, the ones from the early Rock Band series kept coming up in particular. And upon further inspection, yeah, these things are already way more similar to the real thing anyway. Like, shockingly. So ordering an old PlayStation 1, can we turn this into something we can actually plug in and rock to? This is Kevin from Setsu Much. Now, the headstock itself has 6 pretend tuner holes, but they're too close together, and the neck itself looks pretty thin. A max of 21 inches for a practical nut-to-bridge scale length would land us just above a baritone ukulele scale length, so maybe dropping to 4 strings would be more appropriate anyway, and help us reduce tension. The biggest design concern for me was tension, so to help make this extreme hollow body, and neck for that matter, more solid, I ordered different kinds of epoxy resin, adding a cigar box pickup with pre-wired volume and toe knobs to my cart while I was at it, something comparable to the original clicker size, but I would rotate at 90 degrees. I'd recycled most of the hardware from the headless 9-string conversion project, with other stuff also being what I had on hand. Thinking I might want to try some non-ferromagnetic strings down the road, like maybe those for a baritone ukulele, I added a hidden piezo pickup under the bridge with its own dedicated volume knob before joining up with a single coil, giving us 3 knobs to play with. Upon gutting it, there were a lot of cool electronics already inside, like an accelerometer, and an even more familiar potentiometer connected to the pretend whammy bar I thought we could use as a master volume/kill switch kind of thing for all of this before going to an output jack. Although it's not doing anything at this point, I decided to leave the selector switch in there for mostly aesthetic reasons, and decided to just go ahead and jump into building now. For the sake of having at least a smooth, fretless setup to work with for now, I poured a quick setting epoxy over the fretboard and buttons in a natural press-down position, having built a perimeter out of tape, making sure to also cover any areas it could leak from. Within an hour, it was hard enough for me to feel comfortable with how everything was settling, and the next morning I removed the tape. Obviously, I should have used painter's tape instead of that duct tape because I did have to pick out some of those little fibers that also got caught in the epoxy. But sanding the whole surface smooth to a nice radius the pretend fretboard had, it's starting to look decent. Like my other fretless conversion project, I used several layers of superglue to strengthen the surface, and despite some minor scratching of the colored button markers on the side and minor bubbles in the epoxy, I was happy with it, polishing everything off with a super high grit paper one final time. The plastic nut was easily superglued to the surface of that, carefully cut with a coping saw, and finally I used a longer setting epoxy this time to fill in as much of both inner portions of the 2 halves of the neck as I could. For the headstock, I cleared out some support material and fashioned a wood structure to fit between its 2 halves. Thinking maybe I should connect the spaces where the 2 middle machine heads would go, I added some simple patches for any re-drilled hole gap now, before solidifying the whole thing again with the slow setting epoxy. With everything screwed back together, the new holes came out reasonably spaced. However, it turns out this pretend headstock is just a little thicker than your standard Stratocaster. So, one last improvisation had me remove some of the headstock backplates, secure the machine heads directly to the wooden structure, after also removing just a few subtle notches on the side as well. I finally got everything to screw together again with the rest of the neck, adding some super glue to the whole thing to make sure it was all one solid piece. I have no intentions of reopening this thing ever again. The body was a bit of a head scratcher, but I simply cleared some support material trying to figure out another wooden structure to sandwich between the 2 halves for the bridge to mount through, like I did with the machine heads on the headstock. Trying to leave room in the center and right side for the pickup and electronics, I poured more epoxy again. Short of just filling the entire thing up with epoxy and rerouting from there, this minimalist attempt mostly worked, except for a miscalculated leak out of the back, now creating a bit of an awkward exterior blemish. The slower setting epoxy needed more precaution and monitoring than what I used on the fretboard surface, but the faster setting epoxy generates a lot more heat, which I feared on these inner portions could warp the entire structure. So thinking I was done with epoxy now at least, I proceeded to cut out a horizontal space for the pickup, with just a few clicker supports to knock off the top as well. With the newly designed pickguard for the new electronics, including a spot for the bridge to sit as well, I tried to eyeball everything up center down the neck before committing to drilling some holes for the strings to pass through the body and onto our bridge saddles. Adding string ferrules on the back, you can see we got some decent placement even though we used just that drill block. Now, with the obvious area where the bridge will sit on the top half also marked out by these holes, I added one more flat piece of wood that would make a tight squeeze between the two halves of the body there, that I knew would also pin a piezo under the bridge with even pressure. Whittling away at that pretend Stratocaster output jack, it's basically as good as the real thing, just a little smaller, forcing me to accommodate the cable coming in at more of a downward angle, but still pretty flush. It thankfully just screwed back into place with no headaches other than some accidental nicks. With everything together at this point, I could finally bolt the neck at least onto the bottom half of the body, and start trying my best to add shielding for the electronics. Because this whole bottom right half is pretty much open, I was able to extend the copper tape to touch the ground of the output jack directly, which also gave me the idea to extend the tape out to touch the bridge as well, with solid contact between the two halves through both the rim and the area the bridge will push against. I started drilling some final mounting holes for those saddles, but quickly found out that, of course, the first screw I placed interrupted the pretend whammy. The front screws alone held everything in place for an initial test setup, but I superglued them down instead anyway, so I don't have to and re-screw those things every time I want to get inside. This first test also revealed that I need to add a simple string tree, but more importantly, I learned that the neck and body were still not very sturdy, flexing under its own weight even. Seeing that I accidentally reversed the Pretend Whammy's master volume pot too, I cracked it open for final touch-ups and ditch effort reinforcement. Printing out a final tweaked pickguard to fit everything better, while also trying a different paint style, I gave it all one more final cleaning before putting it together again. I'm using the middle 4 strings of a standard 6-string guitar set basically, so we can try a couple of different tunings around that and maybe figure out how to use any of this guy's quirks to our advantage. So what do you guys think? Would you feel like a real guitar legend plugging this thing in now? Or is it still just a toy with no real potential besides the gimmick? Thinking critically back to how these games may have actually helped prepare me for the real thing, I can remember that the blue and orange buttons were difficult to hit with my pinky, but as I got better at the game, maybe I did actually increase my strength and dexterity. Of course, going back now, what used to be a painful green and orange button combination now feels like nothing, and I'd even be okay to stretch to a 6 button even. While researching the different kinds of game controllers out there were actually some really interesting, almost fully MIDI ones for people that got really into this. Rock Band eventually had a pro mode with actual fret indicators coming down that highway, so you were playing the real thing more or less. Rocksmith, a game I also dabbled with, however, did this a lot better, with you being able to plug in any guitar you have and using its output to translate into whether you're hitting the notes or not. What are some of your all experiences with these games? How into it did you get? Or are you a purist who was practically born with a real guitar in their hands? It'd be pretty cool if this thing still functioned as a working controller. And I actually do have a lot of ideas for a version 2, with a lot of cool tools out there to create custom tracks to play along to, and a still pretty alive community I found out there. For now though, enough said. For early video access, raw instrument tracks, and more exclusives, find our community on Patreon and consider adding your support.
Said too much.